In a high-stakes congressional hearing broadcast live to over 18 million Americans, Jasmine Crockett confronts Elon Musk with disturbing evidence from Tesla's factories, hidden injury logs, internal emails, and a secret list targeting immigrant workers. Musk scoffs, accusing her of being anti-technology, but the room shifts when Crockett lays out photos and sworn testimony from those left behind in the race for innovation. The hearing chamber freezes, senators stunned, the audience breathless, as the world's most powerful CEO is forced to face voices he tried to silence. If Elon Musk can build rockets to Mars, why can't he build a future that includes dignity on Earth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted ceiling of the Rayburn House office building, room 311 buzzed with quiet tension as national networks cut to a live feed. It was supposed to be a routine congressional hearing, an inquiry into labor conditions at Tesla's sprawling factories in Texas, Nevada, and California. The room was filled with the usual suspects: lawyers in Navy suits, aides scribbling notes, and members of the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections seated in a semicircle behind nameplates. But before the chair could strike the gavel, a ripple of murmurs broke out. The heavy oak door opened. In walked Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, unexpected, unannounced, and very much out of place. Her name hadn't been on the official schedule. She was stepping in for a Democratic colleague who had suddenly withdrawn due to medical complications. But the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Camera lenses snapped toward her, but just as the chamber had begun to steady under the force of Jasmine Crockett's silent arrival, the atmosphere shifted again, this time with a colder gravity. The doors opened not for justice, but for dominance, cloaked in the quiet arrogance of wealth that no longer needed permission to be heard. Elon Musk stepped into the hearing room as if it were merely another launch bay, one more platform from which to propel his legend. He didn't walk like a man entering federal scrutiny. He walked like someone arriving to reclaim his narrative. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, his pace was slow enough to suggest control, but fast enough to signal impatience with ceremony. His suit was understated, but flawless. His tie the same storm gray shade as the Tesla Gigafactory rooftops. Even the small Tesla emblem on his lapel caught the overhead lights like a signature. He offered no glances to the press pool, no nods to the committee. His only acknowledgement was a calculated pause at the witness chair, a second's delay that said, "This isn't your moment, it's mine." Then he sat, fluid, centered, utterly undisturbed, his fingers unfurled beside the microphone, as if no one else in the room had ever had anything worth saying. He leaned forward before anyone could even address him, adjusting the mic with the casual precision of a man used to commanding satellites, rockets, and boardrooms. "Let me save us all some time," he began, his tone soft but fortified. "Tesla is not your enemy. Tesla is the future of the United States economy." He didn't blink, didn't breathe between lines. "While others regulate and litigate, we innovate. While Washington squabbles over policy, we build the next generation of American dominance." The words weren't statements, they were proclamations, dropped with the confidence of someone who had seen regulators come and go, but had never been caged by one. He dismissed the hearing itself with a single sweeping gesture. These allegations, manufactured by media outlets desperate for relevance, fueled by the far-left factions who despise anything they can't control. This isn't about labor conditions, it's about political theater. It's about punishing ambition. And with that, he leaned back, not in retreat, but in satisfaction. Every word was a shield, every sentence a weapon. He wasn't defending Tesla. He was elevating it, transforming accusations of human harm into accusations against his accusers. He invoked freedom, innovation, American values as if they were patents he already owned. The factory injuries, the racial discrimination lawsuits, the suicide attempt on the Fremont floor. Left unaddressed, unspoken, strategically erased. In their place, Musk projected an illusion of greatness so blinding that anyone who dared question it could be dismissed as anti-progress. And therein lay the injustice, because across the table sat Jasmine Crockett, the only voice in that room explicitly chosen not by wealth or Wall Street, but by people who'd been ignored by both. And now she was being told, before she could speak a single word, that this hearing, this process, this country's attempt at accountability was a waste of his time. The cameras didn't blink. The world didn't turn away. But in that moment, power made itself known, not just in Elon Musk's words, but in the quiet certainty behind them. That in America, even under oath, a billionaire can still talk louder than the truth. As Elon Musk settled deeper into his chair, cloaked in the illusion of control he had so confidently wrapped around the room, a quiet shift occurred, not in volume, but in intent. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not to match his power, but to dismantle it. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The calm precision in her tone carried more weight than any gavel. "Mr. Musk," she began, her words measured like a prosecutor reading an indictment, "Tesla's internal injury reports from your Fremont and Austin plants show numbers that don't align with the federal records you submitted. Specifically, in the last 14 months, your reported OSHA figures list 43 non-serious incidents. Yet internal Tesla files, which I now have before me, show over 130 injury logs marked serious or urgent, most of which were never disclosed to federal safety regulators." She paused only long enough for her words to settle in the room, like dust after an explosion. "Can you explain the cause of this discrepancy?" she asked. "Or should we assume that compliance, like your tweets, is optional in your world?" There was a long beat of silence, the kind that says more than any rebuttal. Musk's eyes narrowed, but his lips twitched into a controlled, amused curve. And then he laughed, quietly, dismissively, like a man listening to a question from someone he'd already decided didn't belong in the room. The smirk came next, followed by the soft, deliberate clearing of his throat. "Congresswoman," he said, dragging the title out like it was too heavy for her to carry, "with all due respect, and I use that term generously, you clearly don't understand the complexities of industrial-scale production." He leaned back, folding his arms like a teacher correcting a student who dared question the curriculum. "Minor injuries happen in any large operation, but perhaps instead of chasing clickbait numbers, we could focus on actual innovation." It wasn't just an evasion, it was an erasure. He hadn't offered data. He hadn't refuted her claim. He had chosen to reduce her, to belittle not only her question, but her right to ask it. In that moment, he didn't see a public servant confronting a corporate giant. He saw a nuisance to swat away, a soundbite to outmaneuver. The injustice was almost surgical. The room had been asked to believe that power made a man more credible, and that intelligence wore a suit and smirk, not a voice that carried the weight of the unseen and unheard. But Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't flinch or fold. She simply held the silence like a blade, letting the world see exactly what arrogance looked like when it was caught mid-sentence. And as the weight of Musk's condescension still hung in the air, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She simply opened the folder in front of her, as if revealing not just documents, but an autopsy report on the very system that had allowed a billionaire to laugh in the face of human suffering. The room shifted before she even spoke again. Not physically, but in temperature, in silence, in the sheer shift of attention that only comes when someone stops playing defense and begins unveiling truth. Jasmine Crockett drew out a stack of printed reports, tabbed and annotated with brutal precision. There was nothing performative in the way she held the pages. Only purpose, razor sharp and honed over months of investigation. She looked up, calm and unshaken, then slid the first document across the polished wood of the hearing table, stopping it directly in front of Elon Musk with the steadiness of a prosecutor delivering Exhibit A. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice crisp, "since you seem unfamiliar with the realities on your own factory floor, allow me to walk you through them." She paused, letting the room quiet itself again. No one moved. Even the stenographer had slowed, sensing the atmosphere becoming something heavier than routine procedure. "This is a Tesla internal injury log from the Fremont plant," she continued, her tone surgical, "compiled from supervisor reports over the last 14 months. It was never submitted to OSHA, never disclosed to investors, and until this moment, never seen outside your executive circle." She held up the next page. 79 cases of serious injury, not minor sprains or fatigue. I'm talking about skull fractures, third-degree burns, spinal compression injuries, names, dates, shift hours, medical outcomes, all filed, all marked, and most damning of all, flagged not to report. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her cadence was calm, deliberate, made even more powerful by its restraint. Page 6, she said, flipping the document toward the committee members as aides scrambled to replicate copies, contains a summary email from a night shift operations manager instructing that injuries resulting in hospital transport should be internally resolved and not escalated unless legal action is imminent. Crockett's eyes locked on Musk, who sat motionless, only the tightening of his jaw betraying his discomfort. Page 11 is a photo of a 19-year-old worker who lost the tip of his index finger operating an unshielded hydraulic press. His medical intake form is time-stamped 3:14 a.m. Your internal log lists this as minor abrasion. The chamber had gone utterly silent. No gavel, no whispers, just the low building pulse of tension as reality began to erode the facade Musk had constructed. Crockett reached into the folder again. This, she said, lifting a high-resolution color printout, is the photo taken at the scene. Blood pooled beneath the machine, a discarded glove visible near the floor panel, taken by a fellow employee who was fired 2 days later after speaking to a shift supervisor about what he witnessed. The air inside the room turned heavier, as if oxygen itself were holding its breath. Musk shifted, just slightly, his fingers pressed against the edge of the table. His previously relaxed posture began to fold in, shoulders stiffer, eyes narrowing not in arrogance now, but in calculation. He opened his mouth once, then paused. When he did speak, the confidence had been chipped. I'm not aware of this particular log, he said, voice quieter now, noticeably strained. It's possible that these figures, some of them, came from third-party contractors, or perhaps internal classification errors. With operations this large, some misalignment in reporting is expected. Crockett didn't interrupt. She let the words hang, weak, meandering, devoid of substance, and then followed them with the precision of a scalpel. Expected, Mr. Musk, she repeated, her tone still composed, but her words now carried a sharper edge. Is it expected that a billion-dollar corporation misclassifies hospitalizations as bruises? Is it expected that supervisors use private email chains to advise staff not to call ambulances during night shifts unless there's a death? She held up another document, because here on page 19 is precisely that language. Avoid ER calls on weekend shifts. They attract unnecessary attention from state safety boards. That's your company policy. That's your culture. That is what Tesla is, not the future of America, but a present built on silencing the injuries that power your quarterly gains. For the first time since entering the room, Elon Musk looked cornered, not by rhetoric, not by outrage, but by facts he couldn't edit, delete, or spin. The room, once his stage, had become his cross-examination. Behind him, aides began to murmur. Someone passed a note discreetly to his chief counsel, but none of it mattered. The myth had cracked, and in its place, the audience now saw a man, not a marvel, a CEO who claimed to build the future, but couldn't account for the blood on the floor of his factories. Jasmine Crockett sat still, not triumphant, but resolute. Her voice hadn't risen once, and yet somehow it had broken through where millions of voices had not. In that moment, the injustice was no longer abstract. It had names, it had timestamps, it had photos, and it had a witness who refused to let power erase the truth. The wounds had been shown, the blood, the broken bones, the silence. But now Jasmine Crockett turned the spotlight towards something colder, less visible, more insidious. It wasn't just about who got hurt. It was about who never got the chance to rise. She reached back into the folder with the same calm gravity as before. But this time, what she pulled out wasn't about bruises or burns. It was about control, suppression. The invisible lines drawn within factory walls that separated one group of workers from another. Lines never written into any official policy, yet deeply etched into lived experience. Mr. Musk, she began, her tone steady but razor-sharp. The injuries we've discussed are a tragedy. But what I have here, she raised a stapled document bearing Tesla letterhead and the subject line, personnel monitoring, tier classifications, reveals something far uglier than negligence. It reveals intent. The page trembled slightly under the overhead lights as she held it up. This is an internal communication from Tesla's Fremont HR department, dated March 3rd. It outlines what's referred to in your own system as a Tier 3 employee watch list. She let the phrase hang there, the weight of it anchoring the room. This list includes names, ethnic background, country of origin, and behavior assessments. Most notably, references to employees deemed resistant to productivity directives or showing signs of collectivist leanings. She lowered the page slightly, eyes locking on Musk like crosshairs. Do you deny that such a system existed under your watch? He didn't answer, not immediately. So she pressed forward, the pace deliberate and suffocating. Because according to this document, over 70% of the individuals flagged under this so-called Tier 3 designation were Black or Latino. Nearly half were first-generation immigrants. Many had spotless performance reviews, but they were still marked. Her hand moved to the second page. And here, this is an email dated April 7th, written by a regional plant manager. It reads, Tier 3 profiles should not be assigned to the AI calibration wing or the robotics learning modules. Too much risk in giving certain individuals advanced system access. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every syllable was a blade. The injustice wasn't just in the content, it was in the calmness of how it had been written. The clinical phrasing, the corporate vocabulary that reduced living, breathing workers into liabilities and threats. This wasn't a rogue manager, Crockett continued. The distribution list on that email includes 3 HR leads and 2 directors of operations. The policy was known. The language was repeated across multiple memos. And nowhere is there a correction. No objection, no audit. Just a quiet sorting system that ensured only certain bodies, certain accents, certain faces would ever stand near your highest levels of innovation. For the first time, Elon Musk didn't smirk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lean back or forward. He simply sat, still, jaw locked, eyes focused on something invisible beyond the chamber. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was calculation. But whatever it was, the armor was cracking. Would you like to tell us, Mr. Musk, Crockett said, her tone now colder than steel, how a company that claims to be building the future of humanity justifies a policy that treats Black and brown workers as a security threat to its machines? The room remained silent, but it was no longer neutral. Even the most loyal eyes on the committee couldn't hide their discomfort. Crockett leaned forward slightly, voice now just above a whisper, but somehow louder than any shout. Or are we to assume, Mr. Musk, that when you say the future belongs to the bold, you really mean it only belongs to those who look like you? She didn't blink. She didn't move. And in that moment, neither did the country watching from behind millions of screens, because the myth of meritocracy had been laid bare, not with fury, but with fact, cold, controlled, and unshakable. The evidence of discrimination had landed like a thunderclap, sharp, undeniable, and cold. But power never folds in silence. It roars. And as Jasmine Crockett's calm exposed the fault lines beneath the polished image of Tesla, Elon Musk did what empires often do when threatened. He exploded. His voice cut through the thick silence like a blade. Gone was the composed, strategic CEO who had charmed investors and dazzled tech conferences. In his place was a man cornered by facts he couldn't bend and a woman he couldn't intimidate. Musk's hands slammed flat against the polished wood of the hearing table. Not hard enough to draw a reprimand, but forceful enough to send a tremor through the microphones. This is a smear campaign, he barked, eyes narrowing at Crockett, the measured cadence of his earlier statements replaced by raw emotion. You're twisting confidential documents and making reckless, defamatory accusations. This is not how reality works. You want to talk about racism? Let's talk about facts. He leaned forward, almost over the mic now, as if proximity could make his words more truthful. Tesla's leadership team includes executives from multiple racial and cultural backgrounds. I've personally hired Black engineers. I've promoted Latino project leads. One of our board advisors was raised in a refugee camp. But you don't mention that, do you? His voice rose again, volume overtaking reason. Because it doesn't fit the narrative you're trying to force-feed this hearing, or the country. Without being asked, he reached into his prepared notes and held up a printed statement, waving it like a shield. $200 million, he said. That's how much we've invested into STEM education programs targeted specifically at underrepresented communities. $200 million. The words hit the room with the velocity of missiles, but they lacked precision. Thousands of kids from low-income neighborhoods, Black, Latino, Native, have been given the tools to build their future because of what Tesla made possible. You think we're the enemy? We're the ones building the solution. A murmur stirred among some of the Republican members at the far end of the bench. One senator tilted his head and gave an approving nod. Another leaned back with his arms crossed, glancing toward Crockett with faint disdain, as if to say, "Now what?" The energy shifted, not in a wave but in a ripple, subtle and political. A billionaire, passionate and cornered, defending his legacy with a voice loud enough to shake the walls. And for a moment, for just a moment, it worked. Sympathy flickered in the air, not because Musk had proved innocence, but because he was powerful, and powerful men so rarely had to defend themselves. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice to meet his. Her posture was unmoved, her hands neatly folded, her gaze locked on him like a surgeon assessing a patient's final, futile resistance. Because what Musk had just done wasn't a defense. It was a tactic, an attempt to drown fact with fury, to rewrite evidence with emotion, to trade guilt for volume. She had seen this play before. So had America. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was warning. Musk's breathing had changed. His voice, still defiant, was beginning to strain at the edges. "You don't get to stand there and act like we're the bad guys," he snapped. "We're solving the problems this committee has debated for decades. We're putting EVs on the road. We're hiring thousands of workers, tens of thousands. Do you know how many of them are first-generation Americans?" He didn't wait for a response. "You're cherry-picking memos, twisting words, and you're doing it for a soundbite. Because that's what this is, right? Theater." The word lingered, ironically, as he gestured wildly. A man unraveling, not because he was guilty of one moment, but because he had built his world on the belief that power was a shield. Now that shield was cracking, and even as a few committee members nodded along, even as he raised his voice and waved the STEM investment like a golden ticket, the room had changed. The public wasn't watching a visionary anymore. They were watching a man threatened by truth and doing everything he could to escape it. Jasmine hadn't spoken in minutes. She didn't need to, because while Musk stormed, while his voice climbed higher and his justifications grew broader, the documents she had laid before the committee were still there, still real, still bleeding truth into the record. What Musk had offered was noise. What Crockett had delivered was evidence. And though some tried to look away, tried to shift the narrative back toward comfort, back toward power, back toward the myth of the benevolent billionaire, the truth remained. He had raised his voice. She hadn't. He had shouted his resume. She had submitted receipts. He had demanded respect. She had earned it. And in that moment, with cameras rolling, mics hot, and 12 million viewers watching from across the country, the balance of power didn't rest with the man who yelled loudest. It rested with the woman who had dared to confront him and hadn't moved an inch. The room had already endured accusations, fury, and the echoing weight of truth. But what came next wasn't noise. It wasn't data. It was the brutal stillness of a reality no billionaire could erase. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised her finger, pressed play, and let the evidence speak. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind the committee desk came alive with a blinking timestamp. Tesla Fremont, internal surveillance, Bay 12, 10:38 p.m. The footage was monochrome, the angle wide, elevated from a ceiling corner like a watchful, indifferent eye. Machinery filled the frame, conveyor belts, mechanical arms, and the cold rhythm of automation. At first, the scene appeared ordinary. A woman, mid-30s, identifiable only by her reflective vest and tired gait, moved through the frame carrying a clipboard. Then, like a string snapping under too much pressure, she collapsed. Her legs folded beneath her. The clipboard skidded across the floor. Her body landed hard. No one came. What followed wasn't an emergency response. It was absence. The woman lay there, still as concrete, for 10 minutes. Then 30. At 11:16 p.m., a forklift passed within 3 feet of her motionless body. The driver didn't stop. At 12:03 a.m., two workers walked by chatting, one briefly glancing down, then walking on as if she were a misplaced jacket. The production line never paused. Machines worked. Screens blinked. Time passed. 1:41 a.m. 2:12 a.m. At 2:53 a.m., a janitor finally knelt down beside her. A shaky radio call. A single nod. But no sense of urgency. No siren. No medical team rushing in. 4 hours and 12 minutes of corporate silence. As the footage faded, a second video immediately followed. This one was raw, intimate. A handheld phone recording. Maria Reyes, the woman from the floor, now sat upright in a modest living room. Her hair was pulled back, her posture slumped forward. The exhaustion in her eyes was something no high-definition lens could soften. She spoke in Spanish, her voice slow, deliberate, painfully steady. "I didn't scream," she said, "because they told us screaming was a sign of weakness. I thought someone would notice. They didn't. They always say, we are part of something big. But I was alone. For 4 hours I was invisible." Her fingers twisted a tissue in her lap, not from nerves but as if holding it was the only thing reminding her she still had hands to use. "We are machines to them. If we break, they leave us. If we bleed, they call it inconvenience. I wasn't a woman in that factory. I was a tool that failed." The video ended not with music or fade out, but with a still shot of Maria, looking straight into the camera, eyes hollow and defiant. The screen went black, and then came the silence. A silence that didn't come from uncertainty, but from recognition. A truth too brutal for rebuttal. Not a soul moved. One senator adjusted his tie, then stopped halfway, his hand frozen near his throat. Another, a man who had earlier muttered support during Musk's fiery defense, removed his translation earpiece and set it on the table like it weighed more than gold. No one asked for clarification. No one objected, because in that moment, no one could. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes not on Musk, not on the screen, but straight ahead, unshaken. She had said nothing since the video began, and yet her voice was everywhere, in Maria's fall, in every tick of the timestamp, in every second that passed without a helping hand. What she delivered wasn't a question, it wasn't a theory, it was a reckoning. A direct confrontation not with policy, but with conscience. This wasn't a labor statistic. It wasn't a partisan stunt. It was one woman left on the floor of a billion-dollar empire, and a nation watching, finally forced to ask why. The chamber still throbbed with the ghost of Maria Reyes' testimony, a silence so dense it choked even the air. But for men who've never been held accountable, silence is intolerable. And so, Elon Musk did what billionaires do when the truth draws blood. He struck back, loud, fast, and personal. He surged forward like a man flung out of orbit, no longer bound by decorum or calculation. "This hearing is a sham," he spat, his voice no longer firm but feral. "This isn't about workers, it's about you." He pointed sharply at Jasmine Crockett, not with the civility of disagreement, but with the venom of accusation. "You stand there acting like some righteous crusader for justice, but you're not fooling anyone. You're a hypocrite wrapped in outrage, financed by far-left tech-hating interest groups that don't give a damn about factories or the people in them." The temperature of the room dropped, not from chill, but from impact. Musk was no longer defending Tesla. He was trying to demolish the credibility of the one woman in the room who had refused to bow. He didn't stop. Let's not pretend your hands are clean, he barked. You've taken campaign money from political committees that have openly advocated for dismantling private enterprise. Your name is attached to bills that would cripple innovation. And now here you are, grandstanding, cherry-picking memos, playing edited footage like it's a courtroom drama. You're not here for truth. You're here for clicks. His voice cracked on the last word. Not from weakness, but from force. He had leaned so hard into the mic, it distorted. You're building your career on trying to destroy mine. And there it was. The strategy laid bare. Strip her of integrity, accuse her of bias, paint her as the villain in the very story she had just unmasked. It was an old tactic, repackaged in silicon and ego. If you cannot silence her evidence, silence her by questioning why she speaks. The injustice was staggering, not just in what was said, but in how effortlessly it was delivered. A man worth hundreds of billions, whose factories had been caught neglecting human lives, now throwing daggers at the very woman holding him accountable. Hoping the room would care more about his bruised ego than Maria's broken body. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, didn't even reach for her papers. She let him empty himself, let the room hear every word. Because she understood something he didn't. Rage is not proof. Volume is not virtue. And in that moment, under the full weight of Musk's fury, she didn't shrink. She absorbed. And the room saw it. All of it. His voice was still echoing. Accusations, deflections, insults. But Jasmine Crockett didn't need to match him in volume. She needed only one document, one moment. And with the precision of a scalpel, she chose it. She reached calmly into her folder, the motion unhurried yet sharp with finality, and pulled out a single, carefully preserved sheet, one with a letterhead that gleamed beneath the hearing lights like a relic of broken vows. Tesla Motors, Inc. Initial public offering, 2010. The paper itself looked ordinary, but in her hands it became a mirror. She didn't look at Elon Musk. She didn't need to. Her gaze was set on the committee and then on the live camera broadcasting to over 12 million viewers. Before Tesla was a trillion-dollar name, she began, voice low and unshakable. Before the rockets and the robotics, before the suits and the spectacle, there was a promise. Mr. Musk made a written commitment to his employees, a moral compass embedded in the company's DNA, one he signed with his own hand. She held the document higher, giving every pair of eyes in the chamber, and across the country a clear view of the words she was about to expose. And then, without flinching, she read, I am committed to building a workplace defined by respect, dignity, and fairness for all. Tesla will not tolerate discrimination of any kind, racial, gender-based, or otherwise, and we will set the standard for ethical treatment in 21st century manufacturing. She paused. The silence wasn't empty. It was carved, tense, waiting. We believe innovation cannot thrive where justice does not exist. She lowered the page slowly, deliberately, letting those final words sink in like judgment. These are not my word, she said, locking eyes with the panel. They are Mr. Musk's. They were public. They were binding. They were moral. And now, 14 years later, they are a shattered echo behind a wall of broken spines, silenced workers, and internal emails marked "Do Not Report." She didn't need to embellish. The weight of the betrayal did all the work. The shift in the room was tectonic. What had begun as careful observation had become open reckoning. One senator leaned forward, his previously passive expression hardened into something sharper, something closer to regret. From the gallery, a few claps broke the silence, hesitant at first, then joined by others. Even on screen, Twitter feeds lit up with quotes, hashtags, and moments clipped in real time. Tesla's ethics, read aloud and gutted by reality. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, shoulders square, hands calm, the very picture of controlled fury. She hadn't raised her voice once, but the truth had thundered through every corner of the room. Because no amount of shouting could outmatch a broken promise, especially when it's read back, word for word, with the receipts in hand. The room was already cracking under the weight of broken promises and public betrayal. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to bruise a legacy. She was here to rupture it. And as she turned toward the side door of the chamber, what came next wasn't another document. It was a voice the system had tried to bury. The heavy wooden door to the witness entrance creaked open, slow and deliberate, like a warning in a courtroom thriller. A man stepped in, not through the public gallery, not down the aisle, but from the secure corridor behind the dais. He wore no badge, no label. His face remained partially in shadow, and for good reason. His identity was classified under federal protection, but his posture was unmistakably that of someone no longer willing to carry what he had been forced to keep silent. Jasmine Crockett gestured toward him without speaking. The chair recognized the addition. The room leaned forward. "I was an operations manager at Tesla's Fremont plant," he said, his voice low but unwavering, the kind that carries not because of volume, but because of truth long suppressed. 7 years, between 2015 and 2022. I supervised over 200 employees across 3 departments. He paused, inhaled, and locked his gaze somewhere above the room, as if daring his conscience to stop him. We were told, not suggested, not advised, we were told to suppress injury data, to categorize serious incidents as minor fatigue, to avoid OSHA reporting unless there was an ambulance on site, because Elon Musk didn't want the shareholders spooked. A chill ran through the chamber, not metaphorically, but physically. Even the air conditioning seemed to still. One committee member, who had until now remained silent, leaned forward, eyes locked on the witness as if trying to process the weight of what was being said. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the man breathe. Let the silence follow his confession like a funeral drum. And then she moved again, quiet, surgical. From her folder, she extracted a contract, thick, official, branded with the Tesla legal header and the sharp lines of corporate confidentiality. She held it in the air and passed it to the committee clerk. "This," she said clearly, "is a non-disclosure agreement signed by this witness. It's standard issue for Tesla middle management. But Clause 7 is what matters here." She tapped the text. Clause 7 states that all internal reports regarding workplace incidents or procedural failures must be approved by Tesla Legal before being submitted to any external regulatory body, including OSHA or independent auditors. Violating this clause constitutes grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of all exit compensation. She stepped back, then added, "The final signature on this NDA, executed in 2019, is Elon Musk's." The room didn't gasp this time. It simply froze. The witness, his hands now visibly trembling, not from fear, but release, nodded once. "We weren't managing safety," he said. "We were managing perception. We were coached on how to rewrite reports. We were instructed to fire employees who repeated injuries too often. And we were reminded constantly that our silence kept the company strong. Because if we talked, we weren't just betraying Tesla, we were betraying Elon himself." No one spoke, not the committee, not the press, not Musk. Because in that moment, the hearing had stopped being a hearing. It had become a reckoning. One man's testimony, shielded for years behind contracts and fear, had finally breached the wall of immunity. The system that once relied on silence had just been forced to hear its own voice, and it was trembling. The witness stepped away from the microphone like a man unburdened, leaving behind words that hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. But the tremor didn't stop at Capitol Hill. Within minutes, the damage radiated outward, reaching screens, servers, and stock tickers across the world. The first alert hit like a shot across the bow. At exactly 11:42 a.m. Eastern, Bloomberg's breaking banner lit up across monitors in every major financial newsroom. Tesla stock falls 5.7% in 17 minutes amid congressional testimony on labor suppression. What had begun as a televised hearing had just become a corporate crisis. Market traders, glued to their dual screens, watched the green line under TSLA nosedive into red territory. $5 billion in valuation vanished before Musk could even shift in his seat. The algorithms didn't wait for legal nuance. They responded to something purer: fear. Investor chat rooms exploded. Screenshotted testimony from the protected witness hit Reddit's R stocks within seconds, then migrated to Discord servers and investment blogs with blistering speed. CNBC cut from scheduled programming to live coverage of the hearing. Jim Cramer looked visibly stunned. "This isn't just optics," he muttered. "This could be systemic." Inside the chamber, the news hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but the ripple was felt like a subterranean quake. Phones buzzed on silent. Congressional aides huddled behind committee benches, eyes locked on updates from the markets. One analyst at the back of the room mouthed 5.7 in disbelief as he stared at his tablet. But the most striking silence came from the witness table. Elon Musk, who had not stopped speaking for over an hour, blasting critics, mocking regulators, and casting himself as a savior of modern labor, was now absolutely unmistakably quiet. His lips pressed into a thin line. His jaw tensed. He reached for his water but didn't drink. His fingers tapped once, then stopped, as if realizing even that would echo too loudly now. Gone was the confidence, the smirk, the dismissive wave. What remained was calculation, sudden, cornered, and cold. For the first time, the man who claimed to be too powerful to be touched had been rattled, not by emotion, but by consequence, not by a rival, but by a revelation that had detonated into public trust and Wall Street faith. Jasmine Crockett didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. She kept her eyes on the panel, letting the silence stretch, letting the moment breathe like smoke from scorched steel. Because this was no longer about opinion. It was no longer about accusations. It had become a chain reaction, and the first link had just snapped. Outside the chamber, reporters rushed through Capitol corridors, phones clutched in one hand, microphones in the other, shouting headlines into live feeds. Tesla implodes on the Hill. Labor abuse testimony sends stocks spiraling. Is this Elon Musk's first real reckoning? Within Tesla's Palo Alto headquarters, internal Slack channels lit up with panic. Engineers posted, "What's happening?" under lock threads. HR managers forwarded links to legal, asking whether NDAs signed in 2019 were still enforceable in light of federal testimony. An unnamed executive closed their office door and canceled all afternoon meetings. A request was filed within the hour to pull internal injury logs from the last 3 years for emergency audit. Meanwhile, the screen inside the hearing room flickered with real-time market data, broadcast silently on the lower ticker as part of CS-PAN's feed. The world was watching and measuring impact in real time, one lost dollar at a time. The weight of truth was no longer abstract. It was financial, it was structural, it had weight on spreadsheets and shareholder calls. Musk still hadn't spoken, and that silence said more than any PR statement ever could. But the true tension wasn't just in the silence, it was in the knowing that every second he didn't speak, every tick of the market downward, every clipped quote from the witness was burning through a carefully manufactured legacy. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, eyes forward, spine straight. She knew what this moment meant. She had seen it coming, not as spectacle, but as justice surfacing. The system had protected Musk for years with contracts, with stock performance, with adoration disguised as innovation. But now the mask had cracked, and behind it was a man staring at consequences he couldn't engineer his way out of. The committee chair leaned into the mic, clearly sensing the gravity, but choosing not to acknowledge the market chaos just yet. "Let the record reflect," he said, voice neutral but heavy, "that the witness testimony has been received and sealed under federal protection." Cameras zoomed on Jasmine's face, serene, unshaken, not because she felt triumphant, but because she was grounded in something Musk could never manufacture. Truth that costs nothing to tell, but everything to suppress. And somewhere behind her, a notification pinged, subtle, digital, and piercing in its timing. Tesla, minus 6.1%, and falling. The damage had already been done. Testimony delivered, silence broken, stock markets shaken. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, because truth without clarity is a whisper, and she had one final sentence that would make the walls of power tremble. She rose slowly, the room holding its breath as she reached for the microphone. Elon Musk sat frozen, his silence now a void too deep to fill. Across the dais, committee members stared, not just at her, but through her, knowing instinctively that whatever she was about to say would outlive the hearing. Jasmine Crockett's voice came low, steady, and deliberate, not performative, but prophetic. "Mr. Musk," she said, eyes locked on his for the first time in minutes, "you've built rockets, launched satellites, and promised to colonize Mars." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "But after everything we've heard today, I'm not sure you've learned how to treat the people here, on Earth, like human beings." The words landed like a thunderclap. Not a single soul spoke. Not a paper rustled. The pause after her final line stretched into something holy, not silence but reckoning. And then, without cue or coordination, the room erupted. One senator rose to his feet, followed by another, then another. Staffers stood. Journalists stood. Even those who had hesitated to react earlier now couldn't remain seated. Applause tore through the chamber. Not wild or chaotic, but righteous. The sound of truth being recognized in real time. It wasn't for performance. It was for justice. Musk remained seated, unmoving, hands clasped tight, jaw set in a grim line. There was nothing left to say. The myth of the visionary who could do no wrong had collapsed in front of a live audience, dismantled not by a scandal, but by accountability. The applause built, wave upon wave, not driven by politics, but by catharsis. A shared moment, rare in Washington, when ideology bowed to conscience. Jasmine stood still in the middle of it all, not triumphant, not smug, just grounded. The weight of every story, every document, every voice that had been ignored for years, now converged in the echo of her words. The clip was uploaded to CSPAN's feed within 60 seconds. NBC, CNN, and MSNBC all cut to the moment mid-sentence. TikTok flooded with edits, side-by-sides of Musk promising to make humanity a multi-planetary species, next to workers bleeding alone on concrete. On Instagram, stories exploded. And though Crockett hadn't crafted her line for virality, it went viral anyway. Not because it was catchy, but because it was undeniable. In less than 8 minutes, tens of millions had watched it. In 15, it was on every continent. In 20, even critics who once rolled their eyes at her fire had to admit she'd made the world stop and listen. But inside the chamber, it wasn't about algorithms or applause. It was about justice. About a moment so sharp and human that no tech empire, no PR machine, no prepared statement could soften its edge. Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground, endured slander, weaponized facts, and, when it mattered most, chosen to speak not like a politician, but like a vessel for those who never got the microphone. The people who built the factories, the ones who broke inside them, the ones left behind while billionaires looked up at the stars. And now, finally, someone had reminded the most powerful man in Silicon Valley that greatness isn't measured by how far you can fly, but by how you treat those still walking the ground beneath you. He could launch rockets. She had just launched truth. The applause had barely faded, and Elon Musk still hadn't spoken, but the gears of justice were already shifting. Jasmine Crockett had lit the match. Now the entire institution moved to contain the fire. Within minutes of the final gavel hitting wood, murmurs of procedural action turned into official motion. A senior member of the Oversight Committee stood and called for emergency review, a rarely used authority reserved for matters of urgent national interest and corporate accountability. His voice was clear, his expression unreadable. "In light of the disturbing evidence presented today," he declared, "I formally move that the U.S. Congress demand an independent federal investigation into Tesla Inc.'s labor practices with subpoena power and full access to internal records." A wave of gas swept through the gallery. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was the first real strike against a tech titan long considered untouchable. Musk blinked rapidly, then leaned back, his hands now gripping the chair's arms as if preparing for turbulence. The motion passed with rare bipartisan clarity, 11-1 in favor. The lone dissenter looked rattled, as if voting no in that moment was like signing his own political death certificate. Reporters raced down the marble corridors, already dictating headlines into their phones. In real time, public approval surged for Jasmine Crockett. But she wasn't celebrating. She stood off to the side, listening to every word of the motion, her arms crossed, not in defiance but in vigilance, because she understood what many didn't. Justice doesn't end with applause. It begins with accountability. And accountability, real accountability, requires infrastructure. Hearings, audits, transparency, and consequences. That same afternoon, the Department of Labor announced that it would coordinate with OSHA and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to assemble a neutral audit team. This wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. They would interview workers, examine injury logs, review security footage from factory floors in Fremont, Austin, Sparks. Any NDA that interfered with whistleblower rights would be overridden by congressional statute. For the first time in the company's history, Tesla would not control the narrative inside its own walls. And somewhere between the flashing cameras and clattering keyboards, the faces of workers, once dismissed as background noise to innovation, began to surface. News channels replayed a clip of a man with oil-stained fingers, explaining how his wrist had snapped under a robotic arm, then how he was told not to report it if he wanted to keep his job. A young immigrant woman, voice quaking, said she was assigned 12-hour shifts while pregnant, until she collapsed in the restroom and was marked non-compliant. Their stories weren't buried anymore. They were the evidence. They were the truth. Inside Tesla HQ, damage control scrambled into high gear. Legal teams were activated. Crisis consultants were deployed. Shareholders began organizing emergency calls, but none of it could rewind the clock. The federal probe was coming, and this time, the company couldn't engineer its way out. Not with Jasmine Crockett on the committee, not with millions watching, and certainly not after a national headline from the Washington Post declared, "Congress demands deep probe into Tesla after Crockett's bombshell hearing." What Jasmine had achieved wasn't just moral clarity, it was political velocity, translating outrage into motion, emotion into mandate. And as the Capitol rotunda emptied, she walked out alone, declining interviews, shaking off the spotlight. Because the victory wasn't hers. It belonged to the workers, to the woman who had laid on a cold factory floor for 4 hours, to the man who signed away his voice so he could feed his children, to every name on Tesla's silent list. Tonight, their silence had become Congress's thunder, and it had only just begun. The storm had passed, but its devastation was still settling over the chamber like dust on a battlefield. And in that heavy stillness, all eyes turned to the man who once commanded the future like it was his birthright. Elon Musk rose slowly from his seat, no longer the titan of industry cloaked in hubris and applause, but a man diminished by silence. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he had no quip, no retort, no soundbite ready for viral spin. He adjusted the cuff of his sharply tailored jacket as if grasping for control in the smallest detail. His jaw clenched, not in arrogance this time, but in recognition. The ground beneath him had shifted. The chamber door stood open, but not a single camera dared block his path. They didn't need to anymore. The silence he carried was heavier than any denial he could have spoken. His shoes echoed down the marble hallway, the rhythm of retreat measured and tight. Aides trailed him nervously, whispering into phones, avoiding eye contact. No press conference, no defiant tweet. Just a pale face under 2 bright lights, walking straight past the swarm of reporters who for years had clung to his every word like gospel. "Mr. Musk, do you have any comment on the investigation?" Silence. "Sir, what about the factory injury reports? Will Tesla release full logs?" His stare remained fixed ahead, eyes vacant, as if he'd left the building long before his body had. One final question was shouted as he reached the Capitol steps. "Do you still believe you are the future of America?" That one stopped him. Not his feet, but his breath. Just for a moment. And then he walked on. The air outside was thick, humid, and charged. Protesters lined the barricades, holding up signs with faces of real workers, of stories once buried. "We are not machines. Profit shouldn't hurt. Silence isn't innovation," some shouted. Some just stood in quiet defiance. As Musk stepped into the black SUV idling at the curb, one sign rose above the others. It was handwritten, a little crooked, but impossible to ignore. "You promised dignity in 2010. Where is it now?" Inside the vehicle, the door shut with a low thud. final like the closing of a vault. His reflection in the tinted glass looked less like a disruptor and more like a man haunted by the echo of his own vision. There were no advisors speaking now, no dashboard screens humming with stock updates, just silence, deep and deliberate. The car pulled away, and with it, the illusion that charisma could outrun accountability. Back inside the Capitol, the room was still abuzz. Staffers exchanged stunned glances, analysts hurriedly sent notes to media outlets, and a few junior aides whispered what many were now thinking aloud. Elon Musk had just been outmaneuvered not by a rival CEO, not by a regulatory board, but by a congresswoman armed only with truth, restraint, and the voices of people he never thought would matter. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, remained seated. She hadn't moved since the session adjourned. She didn't need to. Her presence had already rewritten the room's architecture. A junior staffer approached and asked if she needed anything, a water perhaps, or an escort to her next appointment. Jasmine just shook her head with a quiet, "Thank you," her eyes still focused on the exit Musk had taken, as if listening to footsteps long gone. Because she knew something that perhaps even he didn't yet. The silence of the powerful is the loudest admission of all. Hours later, headlines exploded across networks, but the most jarring weren't the ones with bold fonts or flashing banners. It was a still image. Musk walking alone, eyes cast downward, beneath a banner that once welcomed tech heroes as saviors of the Republic. Now that same corridor bore the weight of accountability. For a man who built rockets to Mars, it was the walk back to Earth that proved hardest. And in that silence, the world began to listen. The echo of Musk's silence hadn't even faded before the airwaves ignited. This time not with a CEO's soundbite, but with the voice of a woman who had turned accountability into a national reckoning. That same evening, as floodlights bathed the facades of news studios across Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked into 3 different green rooms, each more electrified than the last. First was CNN, where Anderson Cooper, usually calm and clinical, leaned forward with barely concealed urgency. The backdrop was a digital storm of headlines. Musk walks out, Congresswoman Crockett sparks national inquiry, and simply, the truth at Tesla. The country wasn't just watching, they were glued, breathless. The lighting crews adjusted the halo behind her chair. Producers whispered countdowns into headsets. Jasmine sat quietly, composed, the heat of the day still simmering in her blood. But her voice, when it came, was ice-cutting clarity. "No, Anderson," she began, her eyes fixed on the lens. "This isn't just about one man or one company. This is about a system that elevates innovation while bearing the very hands that build it." There was no script, no media coach in her ear. Just conviction born from the stories of people no one had listened to, until now. She spoke of the leaked footage, the denied medical care, the secret blacklists, and the silence that followed, until it didn't. Anderson blinked slowly, visibly struck. For a moment, even the camera panned wider, as if the studio itself couldn't contain the gravity in her voice. From CNN, she was rushed to MSNBC. The crowd outside the studio was massive, gathering not for spectacle, but in something closer to solidarity. Workers from Amazon, Uber, even former Tesla contractors held signs not of protest, but of gratitude. Inside, Rachel Maddow greeted her not as a politician, but as a firebrand witness to something long buried. "Tonight," Maddow began, "we're not asking what happened. We're asking why it was allowed to happen for so long." Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, hands clasped tight, her voice lowering to a blade-like calm. "Because profit made them invisible," she said, "and we, America, got comfortable not asking where our convenience was manufactured." Clips from her testimony played on loop behind them. Musk shouting, the silent factory hallway. The woman collapsed without aid. The NDA page with Elon's signature. The network hadn't seen viewership like this since election night. But tonight felt different. There were no winners or losers, only a nation waking up. Then came NPR. The set was quieter, dimmer, but the weight of what had transpired carried in every breath of the host's voice. "Congresswoman," the host asked gently, "you've been to the front lines of both technology and injustice today. What do you say to those who argue that pushing too hard on innovators might kill progress? Jasmine paused, then looked up, not at the host, not at the camera, but as if through them. I say, she began, her voice raw, if your definition of progress includes broken spines, racial profiling, and silence pain, then it's not progress. It's polished oppression. That moment was replayed on stations across the nation, screens at airports, in subway cars, in break rooms at factories that bore the same kind of silence she had shattered. On TikTok, Gen Z posted split screens of her speech and footage from tech campuses. On Fox News, pundits fumed, but even they couldn't unsee the footage. The floodgates weren't just open, they were gone. And then came the final question. CNN returned for a special late-night segment, framing it with nothing but her silhouette against the Capitol dome. If the people building the future are being treated like disposable machines, the anchor asked, his voice trembling just slightly, then is that future even worth building? Jasmine didn't blink. She answered with a slow inhale.